Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Sam, for being here as our guest. This is, Veteran ETA Roundtable Session 3. We're going to be covering business brokers. First off, also just welcome all new community members. And just a quick recap of what we're doing here. So the Veteran ETA community, it's a community committed to veterans succeeding in entrepreneurship through buying a business. We offer these tri-weekly recorded roundtable sessions, weekly newsletter, with resources to build upon those sessions. And then there's a community element too. We have a Slack where you can post questions and kind of connect with other veterans. All these recordings, all these sessions are recorded, and we have a library of resources on the new website that we just created. So I'll be posting that as well. And so the way tonight is going to work, Sam's going to provide a quick presentation on his role as a business broker. And then there's going to be a robust Q&A following the presentation. And since there's a fair amount of people on here, again, we're just going to kind of go with the structure like we've done, where post your questions in the chat, and I'll kind of moderate the Q&A. And then lastly, a quick disclaimer, none of this is legal or financial advice. Okay, so first, I'd like to just quickly introduce our guest, Sam Domino. So Sam is the head of transactions at Beacon, which is a business brokerage located in Austin, Texas. So Sam is an exit planning expert with experience supporting small business owners. He has extensive knowledge of traditional and SBA financing. And lastly, Sam is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. So the floor is yours, Sam. Thanks again for being here.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, hey all. Nice to meet everybody. Again, as you mentioned, I work on the transaction side over at Beacon. Some of you may have heard of us, some of you may not have, but we're pretty active within the Main Street small business space on the brokerage side. We do operate as a sell-side brokerage for the small business space. However, we do take much more of a model of a marketplace, maybe compared to some of the other listing sites out there or some of the other brokers that you interact with. And so today, I put together a little slideshow. I've kept it pretty high level, but I want to kind of go through it, touch on the basis of sort of what we do, the points of interaction. I believe a SIM was shared out to you all as part of our marketing collateral. I'll touch base on that as well. And then also kind of cover some of the red flags that I often seen, and I'm sure a lot of you all have seen as well with the business broker space. As we know, the space for a long time has been very antiquated. It's very hit or miss. And so hopefully this is insightful to you all, and also gives you all a chance to, again, ask questions and get answers to some of the things that you are currently doing or are looking to do. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen now. Oh, it looks like I can't share my screen.
Okay, let me... Okay, cool. I think you should be good now.
Okay. Perfect. All righty, here we go. Sweet. Let's go ahead and... Cool. So again, yeah, we're going to be covering business brokers today. There's a wide variety of business brokers out there. As we all know, business brokers, a lot different from investment banking counterparts. We deal pretty much just with small businesses. We're not diving into bigger middle market territory, enterprise territory. These are all going to be your Main Street, mom and pop shop type businesses. And so ultimately, that's the area that we're specializing in. So a lot of entrepreneurs are coming our way, a lot of searchers, people looking to buy their first businesses. And we're usually that first point of interaction in discussing the business and ultimately selling it to the prospective buyer. So I've gone ahead and put together a little contents slide here of there's going to be buy versus sell side. Buy side, again, is going to be a little less common in the space. Sell side is much more common. There's a lot more listings out there, and then buyer representation. Interacting with brokers is going to be a big one. As I mentioned before, we'll go over the SIM, broker red flags, and then we'll leave some time at the end for any sort of Q&As that you guys have as well. So cool. So going into the buy and sell side broker side, naturally, as the name implies, the buy side is going to be any broker representing the buying party. They're primarily going to be responsible for all business sourcing on your behalf. So I hate to use this analogy, and my very last slide of the slide deck is going to say how this is not like a real estate transaction, but if you want to keep it pretty high level and think of a business broker as a real estate agent, you can, especially for this. But there is obviously a lot more to it, but it functions in the same way, in that there's going to be brokers representing buyers. There's going to be brokers representing the sellers. For the buy side, really, you as a buyer, if you're out there searching, you're going to have parameters on what businesses that you're looking to purchase, whether it has a certain earnings level, certain industry, geographic location, et cetera. Your broker should hopefully be looking for businesses that sort of match that criteria. They're going to be looking to identify that, help with negotiation, potentially provide some high-level due diligence, though a lot of people will use third-party groups, QOEs, et cetera, for that. And then ultimately help with the transaction management through the entire process. The buy side's usually always paid through a split commission. So usually just like in real estate, if the business is sold, the success fee is going to go to the sell side broker. And if there's a co-broker, in this case, there's a buy-side broker involved, they'll split that commission. On the sell side, again, this is going to be the group that you're going to interact most commonly with if you are a buyer. We are representing the business at the end of the day. They are the ones paying our fee. I'll dive into why Beacon might be a little bit different than that. The sell-side broker is probably going to take much more of a consultative approach with the buyers as well, since a lot of buyers in this space do not have representation. Buyers are usually a little bit more savvy, younger crowd, understand, financial statements better, understand business operations maybe to a higher degree, and therefore are able to usually do the search themselves. And so oftentimes you'll actually work with the sell side broker to get the deal done, as opposed to having to go back to your own broker, especially if you don't even have one. And on the sell side, one of our primary, roles, I would say, other than acquiring the supply, is going to be doing the valuation on the business. So if you have a bigger business, sometimes you might do a sell side QOE, or you get a third party valuation group to do that. Those cost a lot of money, but usually or at least a reputable brokerage should have the ability to do a valuation in-house, and provide a solid valuation for that company, especially within the SIM or to prospective buyers. So that's usually the first line that we do when we take on supply, is if a small business owner comes to us and says, hey, I want to sell, and then we usually determine what the fair market value of the business is going to be. At that point, usually they will agree to sell with us. So they'll sign an engagement agreement with us as their broker. So from there, we would work on the business marketing materials, the SIM, which you all have, the listing itself. Usually the broker will list the business across multiple sites. So Biz by Sell, I'm sure you all are familiar with, businessbroker.net. We list it on our own site as well. So multiple different avenues when it comes to marketing it. From there, we will identify buyers and do preliminary qualification. So anytime a buyer inquires on the listing, or we do outreach to buyers in the space, we want to make sure these buyers are the right people for the business, are motivated enough to make a purchase, have the means of being able to make the purchase, or if they're getting financing, have gotten a pre-qual letter from their SBA lender, et cetera. We also help out pretty tremendously on the negotiation side. That's probably the other biggest aspect of what we do, is negotiating between both parties, making sure both parties are aligned and are agreeable to the deal structure and terms that have been outlined. And then we also help throughout the entire transaction, from LOI through close. So ensuring that the buyer has received all due diligence related items, the seller's expectations have been set, appropriate parties have been introduced, just so that we can stay on track to hitting that close date and getting the deal done. And again, we're paid through sale commission. Broker fees do vary. Sometimes if you're dealing with a much bigger business, you might have a double Lehman scale. So that obviously scales down as the purchase price goes up. But usually a lot of brokers out there have a set commission fee. Some brokers out there have really high commissions. Some have a little bit more reasonable ones. It really just depends on who you're working with. These are good examples of some brokers out there. You have a lot of national franchises. I'm sure you all have heard of Transworld, First Choice, Sunbelt. Typically, these brokers are going to have territories. They're going to have the franchise brand backing and recognition that comes with that. You're going to have more regional brokers in the middle, Horizon, other groups that might have more specialty within the space into a geographical area or the size of business they're dealing with. And then oftentimes they're just going to be independent brokers. So really anybody could get up off their couch and call themselves a business broker. The barrier to entry is really small, which is a red flag. But there's going to be a lot of people out there that potentially want to sell businesses, and they can certainly do so. But there is a lot of knowledge that comes with that a bigger national franchise or regional brokerage is able to provide that they're not going to have. They're also going to provide the marketing abilities for them. They're going to provide the leads, et cetera. Just as if you worked with a Keller Williams, something of that nature. Interacting with brokers. So obviously the big question is how does that go down? What happens there? So usually there's always going to be an initial conversation that occurs with the broker before speaking with the actual seller. Usually you'll all come through an inquiry on the listing itself. So let's say you see an HVAC business for sale on BizBuySell. It meets your criteria. Typically then you'll have an initial conversation with someone like myself where we'll talk about your background, and we'll also help answer some preliminary questions on the business and then help to determine whether or not this is a good fit to move forward. Usually the questions that I like to ask buyers are going to be some that I covered earlier. What industries are you interested in? A lot of buyers are agnostic to the industries as long as their earnings hit a certain level, which is totally fine. Sometimes it does help to be a little bit more specific in what you're searching for, because sellers are probably going to ask the same question of you. Are you looking to be an owner operator? That's a big question I ask. There's a lot of people out there that are looking to be absentee, that are looking to have management already in place. Totally fine. And obviously a very ideal business. A lot of Main Street businesses are very heavily owner operated. So something to take into consideration. But again, questions to ask either the broker when it comes to what the seller does. But this is stuff that I ask, so I have a better idea of whether or not this buyer might be a good fit, or their expectations are set so that they know going in, this might be something they want to do or not want to do. I do like to figure out if they're geographically constrained, if they're in the same area that the business is. I get people that inquire on businesses that are across the country, and usually you want to probably be within driving distance of where the business is, especially if it's a service-based business that without management, unless it's already, absentee run. Again, why this business? Why this one in particular? Is there anything that caught your eye about it from an earnings level, location, anything like that? And then usually I'll ask how somebody wants to go about purchasing the business. Usually most common form is an SBA loan, SBA 7A loan. Sometimes people want to structure it in terms of doing more seller financing, maybe a majority seller financing. Some buyers are cash. Some searchers out there are, investment backed. So they're going to be putting a lot of cash down, maybe with an earnout, depending on the business and how big it is. A lot of different means, but that's also a question I usually will ask. From there, there's usually an internal review. So I'll let the buyers kind of interact with one another if there are multiple buyers, or internally to figure out if it's something they want to do after our initial conversation and they have access to the data room. And from there, usually the broker will help set up the owner meeting. So it's really important that as a buyer, they come to the broker. I'm the one that interacts with them in terms of how that owner meeting takes place. So I can get that set up, and the buyer and the seller can meet appropriately, whether it's through Zoom, through phone call, in person. In person is always better. It's always going to be, but that's something that the broker will facilitate and should facilitate. Buyers shouldn't go around the broker because that can cause issues because ultimately we are representing the seller. We are heavily involved in negotiation, as I mentioned. This is going to come in the form of the purchase price, seller financing structure, the transition period, employee contracts. The broker will usually handle negotiation on behalf of the seller, unless the buyer and the seller are interacting with one another to a high degree, and that's okay with the broker. But it's always good to double check with the broker to make sure that this is okay, simply because we are representing them, as I said. And naturally, an LOI can be submitted. If an LOI is submitted, that's going to go to the broker. It can be, CC'd with the seller, but usually a buyer will present that to the broker. The broker will present it to the seller and come back with any sort of counterpoints that they want to make on the negotiation front. And then ultimately, once the LOI is signed, we move into the post-LOI process on the due diligence, making sure that there's lender introductions, counsel introductions if they don't have that already. As a broker myself, I do help with those introductions. So oftentimes I find buyers who don't have a lender they work with, or they don't have any counsel they've ever worked with. Oftentimes, if I've worked with somebody that I really admire on the bank front, or as an attorney, I will make those introductions so that the process from there on out is really smooth. Because if a broker doesn't have really good connections in the space, that is something to be aware of. I would always ask a broker what lenders they have worked with in the past. If there's attorneys within the state that they're purchasing that they like, and if that attorney can obviously work in that state. But the broker is also going to work on getting those due diligence requests for the buyer. So actively acquiring those for the buyer through the process until we get to close, helping with any sort of document pulling, document requests, everything. Much more hands-on than a real estate deal where you simply go to your mortgage lender, you get the deal done, and your agent's kind of off the plate. We're much more involved here. Cool. So one of the big aspects that we put together as brokers is the SIM. You all are probably very familiar with this. It's going to have the breakdown of the business, the financials, everything you really want to know. For the most part, unless there's additional questions that aren't covered in it. What was sent out was the one that we put together, and it's pretty similar to any that we have in the space. But usually the key components that I like to touch on in the SIM, and I think that's important for really any buyer coming in to review with the broker, is going to be these pools. So obviously a broker should have a cash flow breakdown within the SIM. Everyone knows cash flow is king. It's the most important part of a business. It's going to determine whether it's lendable, if you're going to have a good cash on cash return, etc. So ideally, when you're looking at a SIM, hopefully you have a good cash flow breakdown, a breakdown of the revenue, etc. I think that one of the other really important parts is going to be the employee structure. We try to be pretty clear on who the employees are and what they do, what their roles and responsibilities are, their tenure, W-2, 1099. I would directly go to the employee breakdown. And along with that, the owner's role. Everyone wants to know what the owner does. Are they hands-on? Are they hands-off? How many hours are they putting in? What kind of licensing does the owner have? That should be in the SIM. That should be a place that you look at. And it should also be something that the broker is able to cover as well in the discussions. The business history, obviously there should be a summary on what the business is and what it does. How long has it been in business for? Is this a new business? Is it an old business? The broker should have that information. They should have a breakdown on services offered. So if they're HVAC, are they doing commercial? Are they doing residential? Are they doing installs? Are they doing servicing? What is the split between that? Something of that nature. Who are the people they're selling to? Was their ideal customer profile? So really dive into that, look at that. And then obviously the location and lease is really important, especially if you're getting a loan. SBA typically requires that the length of the lease matches the term of the loan. So understand the length of the lease. If it's up for renewal soon, is the building owned or leased? Is the business expensing the lease payments? How big is it? Does it fit your criteria for what you're looking to do, or is it appropriate for the business? Or is this person just working from home? And if you were to buy the business as a buyer, is it something where you're going to have to acquire real estate? These are all things that should be in a sim. Every sim's different. There's a lot of really bad sims out there, and I've seen a lot of different ones, and I'm sure any buyers here have seen that as well. So if it's not on there, these are good questions to ask. There's more to it than just this, but I think that these are really important points and probably the most common points that I get as a broker whenever I'm speaking with a buyer. So I do have the example sim here that I want to show you guys. We usually just have a breakdown. We'll use like some sort of generic photo as you have to kind of with most of these businesses. We usually have a confidentiality post in here. This is something that we do on our sims, a path to ownership. It's super beneficial for a buyer and also shows sort of the process that will happen for them in the interactions with the broker from initial conversation down to your transition as the owner. So whenever you have the time to review it, definitely do so. I don't want to spend too much time on this since you all have it and we only have so much time, but it's definitely a good opportunity for you all to review. Usually we'll list the SDE for these businesses. A lot of people talk about EBITDA. We focus usually on SDE because these are owner-operated businesses. The owner's cash flow is very important, and you're usually selling these businesses as an owner-operated business. So if you're going to come in, what's the cash flow to you? We will list that as the earnings level, what the current revenue is, how many employees they might have. If it's a part-time employee, we'll usually count that as half of a full-time employee. Not every broker does that, but that's sort of what we have here. And usually we'll list out a history of the business, when it got started, as I mentioned, what has taken place, if anything has changed over the years, et cetera. And we usually try to get as much information as we can, but also keeping it concise. You don't want to make these too lengthy, but it's better to have more information than not. And then we'll have a breakdown on the financial overview from a consolidated cash flow standpoint, deal projections, deal analysis. We'll just break out the revenue, the add backs, the discretionary earnings at the bottom, deal projections. We take a very conservative approach on what's going to happen in the future. It's not the most accurate thing in the world, but I think it's more conservative, especially as a buyer, if you're coming in and purchasing a business, to be more conservative with the projections moving forward. Most common breakdown we see is a 10-10-80 split, 10% down, 10% seller financed, 80% lender finance. That's definitely can change at any minute in the deal structure, but that's usually how we present this as sort of the minimum down that you'll need to make. I know that the SBA SOP is more flexible than that, but that's usually the most common scenario we see. And then we always list out the debt service coverage ratio. You need to know if this is a lendable deal or not, and a broker should know if it's lendable. So it's something that sometimes you might not have right away, but it's good to ask the broker if a deal is SBA eligible, because again, that's the most common form, and it's indicative of there being free cash flow after a salary. So if it's not SBA lendable, like the value of the business is in a way tied to that, unless there's things of value within the business, like customer contracts, et cetera, that can take, essentially replace that. Operations, as I mentioned, location, facilities, square footage, operating hours. etc. We'll list that there. We have all of the lease terms, the rent. If there's any licensing, that's good to check. And then the employee structure, they have a lead technician, service technician, an installer, an administrative assistant. And then we'll list out the owner, what they do. As you can see, 40, 50 hours a week, what, where his time is spent, et cetera, and their service offerings and breakdown. We'll also go in further and do marketing and sales, their reviews, strengths, threats to the business, opportunities, reason for exit. That's a big one. But again, I would say when you're going through this, it's always good to look at those 5 points that I had mentioned before, as a means of kind of, if you need to make a quick glance. In my opinion, everyone's different, but that's usually what I recommend. Cool. So business broker red flags. I think this is super important because you're going to interact with this as a buyer. I'm making the assumption a lot of people are buyers here. You're not necessarily buyers, but I think that just in general, if you are interacting with a broker, it's good to know who the bad ones are, or at least ones that you take everything with a grain of salt. There's a pretty substantial lack of knowledge and materials with certain brokers. Lots of data rooms are empty. SIMs are packaged pretty poorly. Look at that and use that as a good indicator of whether or not this person knows what they're doing. If they can't answer basic questions about the business, not every broker is going to know everything about the business. I get questions all the time that I just simply don't know the answers to because I'm not the owner, but I should still understand what I'm selling. I've had buyers come to me where they say, I spoke to this guy and he didn't even know what city the business was in, which is crazy. Like you should know these simple things, and you should have an understanding of the service offerings and the business as a whole. And they should also understand the M&A process. So I get buyers often asking me, what are the next steps? What do I do now? Especially if they're new to the space. That's really important. If a broker doesn't know, or they're like, yeah, I think you do this, then something to be aware of. And then I often see that people make up business information instead of collecting answers from owner. So if I don't know the answer to the question, I shouldn't just make up something. And if it seems like that's happening, then that's something to be aware of as well. And then communication issues are a really, really big one. The inability to communicate effectively and often. I get a lot of calls throughout the day, and I try to answer all of them. And I like to think I can communicate pretty effectively. There's a lot of brokers out there that don't, or might not get back to you. And if they're not, again, big red flag. They're difficult to get a hold of. If you're asking to meet with the owner and you're a qualified buyer, and they're blocking access to the counterparty, that's a big red flag as well. And if they're just generally unmotivated to sell the business, is this something that they're excited to do, they want to do? That's going to really help the entire deal process from start to finish. It's if they're not motivated to do it, it's going to delay it, and time kills all deals. And then the poor valuation. We see this time and time and again. Nobody's perfect about it, but if a valuation is substantially higher than the fair market value of the business, that's, a lot of brokers in the space value businesses really, really highly just to get the seller to sign their engagement so they get the business. And then they might do price drops over time. Double check to see if the valuation makes sense. Everyone wants to negotiate on this, but it's usually pretty obvious if a valuation or a business is way overpriced than it's not. Check to see if that cash flow analysis is done correctly. And if for some reason, there's an ability to provide a reasoning for the listed price or the provided multiple, that's another pretty big red flag. So why is this price the way it is? If they can't answer that, then they're probably just BSing it and doing what they want with it. So it's just so we leave time for questions at the end. I do want to hammer in the fact that a business sale is not a real estate sale. Brokers who expect the same ease and uniformity are red flags. brokers are expected to be a structured process are red flags. Business sales are very complex. You're buying it as a going concern, and brokers should understand that. If they think it should be as smoothly as a real estate sale, and there's very specific steps you have to take, although there are steps, I would say look at that as a red flag, or approach it with caution, and maybe try to interact with the seller more often than not. As a broker myself, I am really big on building the rapport between the buying and selling parties. So I try to connect the parties as best I can and let them do a lot of facilitating and acting as the mediator between the two. Because ultimately that's going to help the deal out. And you should look for a broker that probably does the same. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. I probably talked too fast at times, but definitely want to make sure I leave time for questions at the end. The broker role is a pretty straightforward role, but we are involved throughout the process as a whole. And I want to make sure I can answer questions to the best of my ability. So let's go ahead and stop this.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, Sam. Really appreciate that. That was terrific access. I know a lot of people can't kind of ask questions to a broker in this kind of manner. So this is great having you here. We got a couple questions. The first question is, how do you do cash flow analysis and earning analysis? Is it tax returns plus financial reconciliation, or all from internal financial statements?
Usually I'm going to base it off of what an SBA lender is going to require, because 95% of the time my deal is going to be done that way. And so I'm going to look at 3 years of tax returns and then interim P&Ls and balance sheets. I will try to get P&Ls that match the tax return years, but ultimately, since an SBA loan is a federally backed loan, they're going to be utilizing the tax return. So that's going to be most important. Now, a lot of small business owners out there like to fudge their taxes, and they'll always complain to me about their add backs, or, oh, my profit's a lot better than that. And sometimes I will use the P&L, but it has to be justified, and I have to be able to find those specific line items and have the backing to be able to make any sort of changes there. But 9 times out of 10, I'm going to use the tax returns.
Awesome. Okay, and second question, can you describe the compensation structure and reasonable ranges as mentioned, high, low, different structures, etc.?
Yeah, so it's really going to depend. I've seen people charge as much as 15 to 20% on the sale of the business. Beacon charges 10% on the purchase price. We used to be lower, but we were priced way too low for the market. But the general market is usually around 8 to 12%, I would say. I don't see many people lower than the 8% unless you're dealing with bigger deals. So if you're dealing with like a double Lehman scale, where maybe after the first 2 million, it's 10%, and the next million, it's 8%, so on and so forth, for an example, that occurs, but you're probably dealing with a, $6-7 million business, or even bigger than that. It just really depends upon the broker themselves. I do know that there's some people out there that charge less than 8, but ultimately brokers also have to know their value. There's a lot of work that goes that's involved in selling these. So that's usually the market range that we're seeing there.
Okay, great. Next question. Is there a cost to use Beacon, or a limit on how many SIMs a person can request?
No, there's not a limit to SIMs you can request. Typically, we are just going to have an NDA per business. So Beacon's a little bit more modern. We do have everything productized within our platform, quote unquote. So you don't necessarily have to, we don't have to email you an NDA and then you have to do that and then go. You can just simply log onto your buyer profile, sign the NDA per listing, and then you get access to the data room that has the SIM and the financials there. So whatever listing you see, you can go and do that as many times as you want. As a broker, I will say this: sometimes I can be a little bit wary if I get a buyer that has inquired on 8 businesses, because then it makes me start to question whether or not they're super serious about anyone in particular. It's not to say they are a bad buyer. I've definitely done deals with people that have done that, but it's sometimes I proceed with caution, because more often than not, those people aren't as serious and it's more window shopping.
Awesome. And got some really good questions here. How long can you negotiate a broker fee?
How long can I, as a buyer or a seller?
I imagine as a buyer.
Oh, how low
Oh, how
can
low can I? Yeah, sorry.
again, every broker is going to be different. It's going to depend upon a variety of factors. I mean, I've definitely negotiated down below our 10%, and still occasionally do. Don't pass it on to other people. But I a lot of factors go into it, like how easy is it to sell the business? How motivated are you as a seller? I sort of have this like ideal seller profile in my mind. And I've dealt with really difficult people who have negotiated hard on the fee, but it really just depends. So if you have a business that is in, you're really motivated as a seller, you have a business in a great geographical location, and you're willing to work with us and have your expectations set, then I'm much more willing to lower that fee. I'd say we probably wouldn't ever go lower than 7.5%, which is what we initially had. But again, it just kind of depends upon various factors.
Great. Okay. Next question. Do you have a back of the napkin calculator for a buyer to do a quick evaluation?
Yeah. I mean, I would say just look at it from an SDE perspective first and foremost. So look at the earnings year over year. I tend to do a weighted average. That's not like the most perfect way to do it, but I've seen a lot of banks say they really like that, where I'll do like a 30-30, 25-15 or whatever it is split across the 4 years. So I'll look at obviously the net profit of the business, and then the appropriate add backs that come with that. So officers comp, officers health insurance, depreciation, amortization. Everyone has their own means of looking at it. Bigger businesses is probably going to be more of an EBITDA focus instead of an SDE, since you're going to be dealing with much higher buyers. But I would say quickly look at that. And then I usually say for service businesses, if you're talking Main Street mom and pop shops, between 2 and 3x on their multiple. I would use that as your ballpark. I usually maybe go 2.5 on it. Depends on the industry. There's a lot of things that affect the multiple. If you're an HVAC business, you're going to get a higher multiple. If you're a small knick-knack shop, you might be below 2x.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the folks, they're in the process of negotiating an LOI, and the seller and them are having a disagreement on price. Big thing is the seller isn't discounting an operator salary for that person and their partner, plus some questionable add backs. They've used the bank as a third-party villain to get priced more in line with real market value. Do you have any other suggestions on how to deal kind of with the seller broker dynamic in this situation?
That's a great question. So obviously this is something that the broker should be handling. And obviously that sucks that that's not occurring. Every buyer is going to be different. So when as a broker, what I'm doing is I'm pricing it for almost like the ideal Goldilocks buyer. Most deals are going to be negotiated upon. The biggest thing that you have to do as a buyer with these sellers is, one, establish enough trust so that they know that they're passing it on to somebody that they want to. And I know that sounds like I'm avoiding the question, but it's super important to be able to get them on board when you're talking disagreements on price. The more meetings you have with them, the better understanding that they have. If you can give and take a little bit, sellers are very, very, very prideful about a lot of things, and they're going to take a hard stance on things. These businesses are their babies. They've had them most of them have had them for a very long time. I would say that showing them the numbers in person is going to be really important. Going over the exact, price, but I would say that the bank is going to be really important as well. Whenever I talk to sellers, I always say most buyers are going to buy this utilizing a loan. If if your business can't be approved by the bank, then your buyer pool goes from this to this. Are you fine with waiting, you know, who knows how long? It could be a year, it could be 2 years for that Goldilocks buyer, and who knows if they will come. And the likelihood of them coming is very small. I know that you mentioned, using the bank's third-party villain to get the price more in line. I would maybe take that route.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If you want to meet in the middle too, you can do some give and takes. Maybe you add on like a non-equitable seller note. So if you want to do something of that nature, I would say that the negotiation is all about give and takes. So if there's a hard disagreement on the price, what can you give them that maybe is a little bit easier for you in terms of the cash that you're providing, but gets them maybe closer to that number, just on the conditions of maybe a forgivable note or a standby note, something.
Great. And one question that I have, or I've spoken with some folks about this, is some businesses for sale, like a lot of people are very interested. So kind of what's your take on how to distinguish yourself from other buyers in the market? And kind of that first, I know you mentioned kind of what you should come prepared, but do you have any kind of deliverables that you've seen that have kind of showed that, hey, this buyer is a little more legit than others, and kind of how do you think about that, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, it's as far as analyzing whether someone's legitimate or not. I think that if they have an understanding of like the type of business that they want, and they're not coming in cold turkey on a business, you're not going to know the business that you're buying until you actually read the information. But if you come in and you seem like you have a head on your shoulders, then I'm absolutely going to listen to you. I'm not saying I like discount people, but like I have a lot of people that come in, and you'd be surprised that these people are interested in buying a business. I've had people being like, okay, so what is this business? And I'm like, I mean, like sometimes I'm like, why are you here? And it's so, yeah. So I would say really understand the business, have like a pre-qual letter ready to go, or say that you're working with a lender right now. That means I know that you're motivated and you've already done sort of like your own personal diligence with the bank. So that's going to be really good. And then how proactive you are with your questions, and your timeline on moving forward. I never want to pressure buyers. I think brokers that do pressure buyers are usually in the wrong. But on hot deals, it's really important to probably ask, hey, like, what's the status of this deal? Is there any deadline on LOIs? If so, and you're interested, I would love to, make the introduction to the owner to see if I'm competitive. All of those things makes me think that you're serious about this.
Awesome. And Sam, what's like a good way to connect with you? You want me to post anything in the group for people to get in touch with you if they have any follow-up questions or want to, check out what Beacon has to offer?
Yeah, what I can do, I can share my email. I'm more than happy to take email questions, etc. Always happy to also hop on a call. The Q4 is a little bit slower, as we all know. People are holding off until the next year to do things. So I'm more than happy to do that as well. And then you can also take a look at our site. We have a really good resource center on our website with blog posts from the buying and selling sides. I would definitely take a look at that. It's been put together by a variety of us here. Definitely driven by our CEO, Will, super knowledgeable about the space. So I would say definitely take a look at that. And I can share this all with you, and then we can send it out to everybody as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a lot of good comments in the chat. I echo everything everyone's saying. That was incredibly helpful, and thank you so much for your time.